It's now my honor actually to introduce quickly the panel chair who will then lead this discussion on the day and areas around it. We are really honored that in the panel we also have the central government czar for safety for factories, DG FASLI, Mr. Dr. Ilangovan. We also have Mr. Sunil Arora from Abilities India Pistons and Rings, he's the chairman there, and Mr. Viraf Mehta, who's expert in human rights and business for several years. But Mr. Banerjee will introduce them further. I would like to introduce Mr. Banerjee himself. He is presently Executive Director for Society of Indian Automobile Manufacturers. He leads the formulation of technical standards and policy, global harmonization, keeping national priorities in sync with sustainable goals of India-centric mobility, environmental sustainability, and energy security. Mr. Banerjee has more than 30 years of automobile industry experience. He is currently chairman of India GRSG Group, member governing council of Fuels and Petroleum Laboratory, Noida, and fellow of IMEC London, UK. Mr. Banerjee, can I now hand over to you?
Thank you, Sandeep, and a very good afternoon to all the participants and fellow panelists. Thank you so much for setting the context and stage for future panel discussion. The subject is known to all of us very well, and safety started more than 400 years ago when the gunpowder factory started by DuPont, and almost that time the fatality rate was 50%, and that's where the DuPont is the leading safety organization, and they have been doing a great work. So then the safety was concerned. Today the safety is concerned, but the levels of safety concerns as the society has evolved has changed. So safety has always been in factories considered with 3M or 3Ps, whether it's a man, machine, or method, or we talk about people, process, or product. In all the three aspects, I think the panel need to do justice, and to do the justice with this panel discussion, we have experts from OEM, we have experts from component manufacturers, and of course, when we talk about people, then human rights become the important part. And to regulate all these 3Ps, we need to have a regulator, and regulator also present here, the perspective of the regulations, standards, and the methods we will be discussing in today's panel. And we have excellent 5-member panel today. And as Sandeep rightly mentioned, and you saw the presentation also by Mr. Raju. Raju is a well-known face, and he is currently senior advisor supply chain Maruti. And his experience is very varied and very rich, and he has been supply chain vertical head in Maruti and different divisions. He was responsible for ensuring business continuity throughout Maruti supply chain. Besides traditional focus area like factory operations, responsibility includes supplier financial health, industrial relations, practices, management strengthening at suppliers company. So Mr. Raju's presentation itself has spoken about his rich experience and what is the best way forward we can take in this subject of safety. Mr. Ilangovan is doctor in this area, and he is IIT Madras postgraduate. He is presently chairman of expert committee to review the existing rules and regulations on safety, health, working conditions, standards pertaining to factories, and docs for proposed labor code. He is the Director General and Chief Inspector of Dock Safety in the Directorate General Factory Advice Service and Labor Institute under the Ministry of Labor and Employment, Government of India, Mumbai. So we will be very much enlightened with his views on the important subject of safety, the deeper supply chain of automobile, and Mr. Viraf Mehta, who is the expert business and human rights. Mr. Viraf is a well-known face in this social anthropologist area of working on corporate responsibility issues, notably with Tata Group 1986 to 2001 and Partners in Change 2002 to 2010. Mr. Mehta has his focus on attention on business and human rights agenda, and is serving as a member of Guideline Drafting Committee of the National Voluntary Guidelines for the Economic, Social and Environmental Responsibility of Business, released in 2011, updated in 2018 by the Ministry of Corporate Affairs. He is also a member of MCA Committee for Business Responsible Reporting. And as far as the component industry perspective goes, so we are very pleased to have Mr. Sunil Arora, MD Abilities, India Pistons and Rings Limited. Mr. Sunil Arora is presently co-chairman of ACMA Skilling and Training Pillar 3 and Managing Director of Abilities, India Pistons and Rings. He has around 39 years of experience and he has steered companies from domestic aftermarket players to 80% export OEM, so very stellar performance. He has been a member of ACMA, Indo-German Chamber of Commerce, AIMO, and trustee of Uma Shankar. So we have a very, very rich panel today. And Ms. Chitra Khanna, she is the head of Safety Initiative, Safe in India Foundation. Ms. Chitra Khanna is presently, heading that, and she is the prime analyst of the report SafetyNiti presented today, which Sandeep talked about. Chitra is an electrical engineer and has the experience of working on the factory shop floors and in the public sector and consulting companies in both non-auto and auto sector. She has also taught in MIT and she moved to the development sector over the past 15 years. She applied her engineering skills to designing livelihood interventions in the communities in the states of Madhya Pradesh. So all in all, 5 panelists, excellent, varied exposures, and we are all set for today's important panel discussion on the very, very relevant topical subject of safety or occupational health and safety in deeper supply chain of auto sector. So Mr. Raju, just to start the conversation during the panel discussion, I would like to throw open one common question for maybe less than 2 minutes each interventions. How do you see this problem and solution? Though you made a very elaborate presentation, but in just a few words, you would like to just sensitize the members present here that how do you see the extent of the problem we are in and what kind of solution you would like to propose from the OEM point of view? Over to you, please.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Banerjee, for the introduction and also for the question. Problem directly, let's get directly down to the deeper supply chain. The problem, if you really ask me, we could put it into 3 buckets. Number 1 is awareness of safety, not only of the workers, but more importantly of the owners and the managers of these units. Second is the resources they have. The second bucket is the resources they have. I had pointed out some of this in my presentation. I'd just like to elaborate 1 or 2 more of them. Like, for example, I told you about that if he doesn't have, if he's finding it difficult to run his show, where does he get the surplus to be able to hire, let's say, 20 people and keep them idle for 20 days while they're undergoing training? This is a problem which the very small scale sector does face. And finally, the third bucket I would like to place is to put name is the motivation, the economic motivation. As long as people can skimp on cycle time by maybe bypassing some safety features to earn a little more, I think this problem will be there. When the cost of skimping on this cycle time, on the safety features, when the cost of that starts balancing the profit, that's when I think we will see improvement. This is the third aspect of it. I think my two minutes are up, but these are the 3 areas which we look at, we think are the essential parts, essential things which we need to address if we really have to make an improvement at the deep supply chain at the small sector.
Thank you, Mr. Raju, for giving an OEM perspective. But often the tier 1s are under pressure from OEMs delivery performance requirement point of view. So I would like to throw open the next question to Mr. Sunil Arora. Mr. Arora, how do you see the perspective of a tier 1 supplier where he is actually under pressure from the OEM to deliver something in the shortest possible time due to the nature of the business we are in, and then you also need to cope up with the requirement of the lower down the tier expectations. So how do you see this problem before us existing today, and what the solution lies ahead?
Thank you, Mr. Banerjee, and good afternoon, everyone. Yes, sir, the problem, as we really see, does not lie too much with the tier ones. It lies down with the next level or the level below that. So as a tier one supplier, all of us are quite familiar. We have the dojo centers, we have the wherewithals to train people, to keep 20 or 30 people. But the real problem is that the owner's mindset is really the main problem in this Indian context, I would say. And so even in where you have these accidents in tier twos and tier threes, there are some very good tier twos. We have only 2 tier twos because our everything is in-house, except the raw materials that we have to buy, and some fixtures from outside. But it's really, you see the differentiation between an owner's mindset and how it plays out in his business. And you have to tell, and you have to perceive, and you have to differentiate between what is the owner thinking. Is he only thinking of making money by skimping, as Mr. Raju rightly pointed out, or is he there to understand that safety makes good business sense? And not even safety, I would say, even the further down the line of sustainability is making sustainable manufacturing makes much more business sense. So one has to pick and choose. Like Maruti chooses its tier one suppliers and make sure that they get the right number of points in maintaining their safety record. We have to be similar in dealing with our tier two and tier three suppliers.
Thank you, Mr. Arora. When it comes to managing the industry, there has to be a kind of balanced approach by the government, and you can't have a very, very regulated situation. At the same time, you can't leave it open to the mercy and whims and fancies of individuals. So thereby, Dr. Ilangovan, I would like to now come to you, that as a regulatory point of view, what kind of evolution you have seen in the past and where we stand today. How do you see a kind of, because during pandemic period, government has come up with number of interventions which really help them in a big way, but a lot more needs to be done. So your perspective on this issue and the way forward, what do you think? So over to you, Dr. Ilangovan. We have Dr. Ilangovan here.
Dr. Ilangovan, you are on mute, sir.
Yeah, sir. Good evening.
Welcome.
Thanks for being a part of this August panel. The question is, when it comes to workplaces, particularly manufacturing, as you all know, that it comes under the Factories Act 1948. And wherever in a particular premises, if we carry out the manufacturing process with 10 or more workers, 20 or more workers without power, within the fixed premises, then it's defined as a factory under Section 2M of the Factories Act 1948. So the auto sector, being a manufacturing sector, taking this 10 and above with power that is any power other than the human, 20 or more workers without any power, only using human power. Then all the automobile industries, auto ancillaries comes under the Factories Act 1948. And this is a very old legislation, in 81. And the present Factories Act is the 6th Factories Act, what we have. And this act was amended in a big way in the year 1987 after the Bhopal gas disaster, bringing in a lot of changes, new dimensions on the OSH framework in our country. And the point is, these Factories Act are supplemented by model rules. DG FASLI, under the Ministry of Employment, we make model rules with the approval of the Honorable Minister. Then we circulate it to the state government to adapt them. The Factories Act and the state rules put together are implemented by the state governments. And we at DG FASLI, the uniform enforcement of this act and rules on the national basis. I'm just trying to give a framework, and we do also conduct annual chief inspector conference, so that you bring out all the views of the state governments and the difficulties while implementing the legislation. All those things are brought to us. This is the overall framework of OSH administration in workplaces, including auto and auto ancillary units. So the criteria here is the 10 workers with power. Sometimes many state governments have brought in state amendments, increasing the threshold from 10 to 20. So with this context, wherever any workplace which is involved in manufacturing process in a fixed premises with the 10 or more workers, they are factory, and all the safety, health, and working condition guidelines, regulatory requirements, rules made and there are to be followed. And of course, as the state dish or the CAF are empowered to enforce the legislation and take corrective actions for the uniform establishment of standards. In the year 2009, government has brought a national policy on shared workplaces, February 20th. This particular policy is in line with the Constitution of India, where we talk about safety, health at all economic activities in line with the Constitution of India. Then 2019, we have brought in the National OSH profile, Occupation Safety and Health Profile of our country. Coming to the current position, I don't want to take much time. Basically, it talks about the Occupation Safety and Health Working Conditions Code 2020, which is one of the 4 codes. This code is subsuming, includes Factories Act. In fact, there are 5 major safety and health legislations: Factories Act, Mines Act, Dock Workers Act, Building and Other Construction Workers Act, Plantation Labor Act. All these acts are brought under this code. Of course, the threshold criteria has been increased from 10 to 20. With power will be a factory. And all the safety and health requirements are to be provided or as it is existing under the Act. This is the brief, I would say, legal framework what is available in our country when it comes to safety and health of and working environment in our workplaces. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ilangan, for giving us a very nice perspective of rules and regulations which needs to be brought in to take care of the safety OHS aspects. When it comes to letter and spirit implementation, the human rights, I think it's often challenging between the ease of doing business, running factory versus retaining and respecting the rights of a human being. So, Mr. Viraf Mehta, your huge experience in handling this subject, how do you see we have come this far, and where do we go from here when it comes to respecting the human rights of a worker who is so vulnerable segment of the supply chain? Over to you, Mr. Mehta.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for your question, and thank you to all the panelists and those who have spoken before us and offered their experience and insights. Since the last decade, 2011 to be precise, I think there's a radical change in the way that we will ever look at these issues in the supply chain, be it safety or any other. And I call attention to the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which I've been involved with almost since its inception and its translation into Indian voluntary standards issued by the Ministry of Corporate Affairs in the forms that were earlier mentioned in your introduction. The problem is that we are referring to these occurrences by, if you like, the shell. We're calling them accidents. We refer to words like safety. But underlying this needs to be a dramatic and abundant recognition that, first of all, these are human rights. with that statement comes the full bearing and the expectation of this international standard by the UN, which spells out in 3 pillars the way to improve the plight of these marginalized, migrant, uneducated, daily wage dependent sometimes workers of ours in our country. In the first instance, there are the things the state have to do to protect the human rights of such people, and I won't go into that. In the second, irrespective of whether the state is willing or able to perform its duty to protect our human rights as workers, there is a business responsibility, a baseline one, which is to respect human rights. And this means do no harm, in short English. And if a harm has occurred, for example, the loss of limb of a worker, then remedial mechanisms are required. And the third pillar, where perhaps the business entity, for any given and valid reason, including size and resources, awareness, the economic motivation referred to by the previous speaker, fails, then these people have access to genuine remedy. Recalling that these people are now permanently disabled or handicapped for the rest of their working lives and beyond. And the cost of that needs not to be externalized as being done, but gradually in steps internalized into the mechanisms, into the value chain of the business that causes these type of occurrences. So if we are to solve a human rights issue, in this case, safety, there are so many human rights issues, sexual harassment, child rights, and so forth, then obviously, sir, you would agree that we need the human rights framework, or we need a framework into which human rights or a rights-based approach has been integrated. Otherwise, we cannot achieve either the sustainable development goals that the company sets or that the globe sets through the form of the SDGs. If we accept that a framework is required based on human rights principles, then, as I mentioned earlier, the UNGPs and the national guidelines are sufficient guide. Very, very briefly to elaborate, this means creating the awareness of human rights, entitlements, and responsibilities, crafting a human rights policies, and this exemplifies the argument that many companies will want, even today, to be successful in their human rights ventures without even having a guiding policy or the words human rights featuring anywhere adequately in their governance. This is changing. So it's really the cart before the horse. How can I work on a human rights issue if I do not have human rights guidance and what this really means? Now, I'll give you one example, just 2 examples very quickly in 30 seconds. The world is moving so rapidly towards mandatory human rights due diligence. And what does this mean in the case of supply chain? Well, first of all, knowing. It's not about naming and shaming a company. It's about knowing and showing by a company. And a company should at least know what the extent of the human rights situation is and whether it's caused on its own as captive supply chain entities or shared by other OEMs, in this case, and other brands in others. And then, having had a human rights policy, undergone training, doing a human rights due diligence, which is a whole cycle of human rights impact assessment right up to remediation, establishing grievance mechanisms, and lastly, the point I'd like to stress on, since this was part of my role with government, with the ministry, of disclosing realities in the supply chain, whether or not one is able to tackle them. And it will take time, and I appreciate the complexities, but one has to narrate what is the stated fact. So I think with the accent on human rights due diligence, of human rights related reporting, domestic as well as international, with the partners we deal with and the countries we deal with, human rights is now not anything else but a compliance and a risk issue. And I think business have to respond to it in ways. So let me end my opening remarks with this first contribution about the place of human rights in this dialogue and its implications for business. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mehta. As the sustainable development goals and sustainable, development demands that we should have a almost zero fatality, zero accident excellent safety records, which is often the tier one, and OEMs have very stated policies in their charter. We also have a zero stress concept where the society should have no intangible, losses also should not be there. While the loss of productivity time is a challenge, we have this OSHAs that make a business sense. So, Mr. Raju, if we look at the company policies and SOPs, how do you think that this can improve the supplier factories over a period of time in a manner that we are able to achieve the deeper supply chain, improve this occupational health and safety targets better? So whatever Maruti has done is an excellent, testimony and example that we have progressed well. But based on the learnings, what would you like to advise? What more needs to be done in this area?
I think the first thing to be kept in mind, Mr. Banerjee, is that it's an activity which will take some time because of the prevailing condition. Today, we cannot afford to say, look, this tier 2 or tier 3 is not good, so we stop buying from him. The reason why we can't do that is that probably a majority of suppliers in the smaller scale have these problems. So the effort is more towards training them, sensitizing them, training them, and supporting them. Then it becomes, after that, it becomes a matter of maybe his attitude or his scale, financial resources. Financial resources is another thing which we think is a serious aspect to be examined. Scale. And like I said, government is moving in the right direction. It's something we have to take advantage of. We believe that safety is scale sensitive. And so one is the attitude, second is the scale. Coming back to attitude, it is when attitudes have been confirmed that despite corrections, effort at correction having taken place, it still continues. That's the time when you start having to take a tougher call. The third aspect is, like I said, and because it's a process which has to be, it'll probably take time. An important aspect of whatever we do, the process has to be a constant upgrading the goals. You start at a certain level, come to a certain level, certain level of goals, some achievement there, then raise the bar further. It is probably this way. Today, if you say that these guys have to become perfect, no, then probably they'll also find it difficult. We'll also find it difficult. So these are some of the things how we believe that the process has to be taken forward. There's one other part of the process. This is this economic incentive. That's a problem. What's the cost of an accident, or what's the cost of poor safety? Today, maybe in the country, it's not so much. So therefore, we have to complement that in terms of our own resolve, in terms of supporting these guys, and if they don't improve even after all this kind of support, then we have to do that other balancing. Whatever you save there, well, you cut too many corners. So this is where we have to take a call and say that it's not okay. So the direction is in all the three. The process is in all three aspects. Support, gradually assess and gradually raise the bar, and then eventually take the tough call.
Thank you, Mr. Raju. I know that PPAPs of OEMs of supplier does include this aspect of OSHAs in an integral manner. When it comes to managing the supply and safety, I think disclosures are one of the very important aspects, as Sandeep highlighted, and Mr. Vinay Mehta mentioned about what kind of initiatives ACMA is trying to undertake. So, Mr. Sunil, I would like to come to you that as a tier one supplier, you mentioned that it's a responsibility also tier one suppliers to look down the line in a deeper supply chain, whether the policies, guidelines, and expectations of the OEMs are translated well, and there is enough cushioning impact is there so that we don't have those surges of safety incidences under the pressure. And also, I know the automation has been one of the biggest press tools. If it is a 52% causing the accidents, I know that earlier there were Kaizen, and Pokayoke is done, but now there is automation where if the worker is putting the hand in, the press will not start. So there are many automation activities have done. So what's your view, Mr. Arora, what kind of efforts you would need to, make hundreds and thousands of factories which are dealing with the, supply of parts to tier ones? How do we reach out and make this priority for them that worker safety is an important criteria for them? So over to you, Mr. Arora.
Thank you. Mr. Banerjee, this is as
Hello, Mr. Arora, can you hear us?
I think he has a poor internet connection. Banerjee?
Yeah.
He has a poor internet connection.
Okay, so while we wait for his...
can you hear me now?
We can hear you, yes.
I've switched on my video. I have a poor connection. Somebody dug up the cable outside just now. So
okay,
there goes. That's for the India for us. Anyways, so you can hear me now audibly, right?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Okay, so what I was saying was that we have to drive it down to the tier 2s and the tier 3s that safety makes good business sense. A worker on a machine present on a particular day gives you revenue. So if you're going to just say that you're going to let the worker go away with an accident and then get another one, it's not going to happen. People are not available today. Post-COVID, manpower, blue collar workers are now the biggest issue. Salaries have gone up by 20-30% because of manpower non-availability. So safety has to be primarily described to the guy down there who has a 10, 20, 30, 50 crore turnover, that it's a good business case, and ask him to adopt low-cost automations. That's the way forward for the thousands of small factories. Low-cost automations, and of course, if you have an accident, you have to tell these guys, if you have more than 10 people, the government has given us now the Shriram ID card. You have to pay 80 rupees a year, and then you get this ESIC benefit. So that is definitely on for and these things are not, unfortunately, not known by these tier 2s, and we tell all our tier 2s to get these Shriram ID cards for their 20, 30 workers that they have. The other thing, of course, is the training, which is absolutely essential all the time. And we call our tier 2 people over to our dojo center, which Maruti has helped us, install. And we show them how training is done for our people, and how, presses, etc. We don't use presses in our companies, but, they, of course, have all these double switches and all the sensors these days. But we continuously keep on training them that you have to adopt safe measures, because if you're not able to meet our demands, then, and today demand is a stop and jump kind of a scenario. So we are now driving down this factor that safety makes business sense, period. If you're not good enough, you're not safe enough, then, you will not be able to deliver, and that will force us to look for other alternatives.
Thank you, Mr. Arora. Dr. Ilangovan, I think to ensure the worker safety, a lot has been done in the form of legislations, and the Factory Act 783 talks about many provisions. So can you explain what does it and how does it ensure improvement towards ensuring worker safety, and how do you exactly implement it on ground? So over to you, Dr. Ilangovan.
Yes, basically this 7A and 7B, they were brought in the 1987 amendment under the Factories Act. This is nothing but the duties of the occupier, and the other is the duties of the importer, supplier, manufacturer, and so on. The basic idea is the entire act imposes duty on the occupier to ensure safety, health, and work environment in a workplace. That's the basic purpose of Section 7A. In fact, in practice, in terms of implementation, this 7A supplements all the provisions given under the particular act and rules. Because the occupier is under the legal obligation to ensure safety, health, and environment for all the workers inside the work premises. That's what it really means. Then it talks about certain specifics in terms of providing training, providing supervision, providing instruction, then providing policy, and as well as providing other requirements like SOPs, protocols, everything. It's basically it's a kind of a section which supplements the entire legislation. He can provide appropriate procedures, control systems, supervisions, equipments, maintenance systems, risk systems, such that the workplaces are maintained safer. Another important point is it talks about training. It gives the focus on the training of the workers. As all of us know, the errors committed by the workers can be corrected only by imparting training. Training is the only thing which can improve their awareness and knowledge, thereby reduce their mistakes and errors, so that the workplace errors are committed to the minimum. Coming to the policy, safety and health policy, because the policy, as all of us know, it should be the initiative from the topmost authority in the organization. Maybe I would say the person having the ultimate control over the affairs of the factory. And the policy, it provides objectives, framework, and so on. We have provided the policy as it is under the legislation. The framework is left to it. In fact, if you go to the state rules, framework, what all should be contained in a policy. And if you look, there's always a mismatch. What the policy, the corporates have, the organizations have, is different from what the law says. So normally, I used to say you should have one corporate policy and another policy on, we can say, safety and health policy for a particular safety and health policy, which is much more detailed. Ultimately, it aims at getting the attention of the occupier and making him duty bound to ensure safety, health, and work environment for the people who work inside the factory. Yes, of course, 7B are not touched. That's also very important. It doesn't restrict to the occupier alone. It talks about your importer, supplier, manufacturer. He's also under the legal obligation to see that his products, substances supplied, imported, manufactured by him do not cause any safety-related concern or risk to the health of the workers. And what are all the concerns in that should be clearly depicted, displayed, communicated, so that there should not be any surprise when it comes to safety and health pertaining to the product that have been imported, supplied, or manufactured for use in a factory. Right. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ilangovan. Mr. Mehta, actually, if you look at our desire to move forward in this SDG goals, so what should be the national trajectory, in your opinion, knowing the constraints in India, and how do we achieve a decent work environment as defined by ILO in Indian manufacturing? And also, I would like to elicit your views that what should the OEM responsibility for safety in deeper supply chain? So, Mr. Mehta, I would like to invite you.
You're on mute, we have enough.
Sorry, am I audible to you properly? Yeah.
Yes, yes.
I want to just, before directly responding to, so far we've been talking about prevention and improving the safety performance, and my suggestion was to follow increasingly the path that was human rights based towards sustainable solutions thereof. And since there's no time to elaborate on that, I want to raise a corollary issue, which is, if you look at it this way, that way back in 1995, the Indian government, to promote our non-discrimination of persons differently abled, the businesses, top companies, would ultimately have a workforce where 3% of their workforce would be comprised of such people. Now, it's to the best of my knowledge, ladies and gentlemen, not a single Indian company has reached that. Now, I've experimented in my time in the Tatas with well-known cases in Titan, where we had a shop floor entirely with persons with disability. Now, the people who have suffered these accidents, I think because the comment of cost was made a second time, I think if we calculate the cost to the economy, to the country, of this sort of disability caused at an early age, I recall from the presentation Sandeep made in their 30s, assuming they're going to work 30 years, and whose responsibility is it? The next part, once they have been disabled, a limb has been lost, whose responsibility is it? And is it not ours collectively to rehabilitate this person over time? Maybe not into the identical employment, but certainly into one that is part of dignity. Now, I'm thinking that in 25 years, if not, one of our best and brightest of our companies have 5% and 3% of persons with disability in their workforce, does not that make the case that despite the constraints of availability and skills, we lag behind this basic target? So then I suspect that a deeper understanding of how we discriminate, not actively, but there's witting and, and unwitting and unaware discrimination, that finally big companies sit and say, well, hardly 1% of my workforce are people who are differently abled, orthopedically, hearing, visually, and so forth, and usually not in the permanent workforce in any case. So I think this sort of scenario strengthens the argument I made earlier that safety as a human right, and then non-discrimination, because once again, when we do look at employment of persons with disability, we do see a discrimination, meaning they're paid less, they're not given the same perquisites and awareness. Now, we cause the disability ourselves, and then we double discriminate by either keeping them out of the employment system or discriminating if they wish to enter again. So this is why, I've sat with colleagues in Maruti over the last few years discussing a human rights policy. And a human rights policy and due diligence would spot these and over time correct them and flag off the salient issues. So I wanted very much, without going into the human rights of the family of the breadwinner, just that person, that worker, what a loss to the nation. But if Indian companies were by now 5 and 10% of their workforce was people with different abilities, I'd have a different comment, but it's not the case. So I think there is a relationship and it's food for thought. Thank you.
So Mehta, often when we talk about the road safety related discussion where 150,000 deaths happen on road accidents, we say 4% of the GDP is lost. So that's the kind of cost we talked about, but I do not know whether Chitra is very deeply involved in this area. She has been doing a great work. So I would like to invite Chitra. Chitra, what do you think your findings related to national and international reporting frameworks and your views, please, Chitra, on the subject?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Banerjee. And I'll take the audience to our SafetyNiti report. And the requirements, the national requirements at present for the 1,000 listed companies is filing their business responsibility report, and the report OEMs which we have analyzed have all filed their business responsibility reports. The problem here is that the NGRBC, the National Guidelines for Responsible Business Conduct, require the principles to be taken across the value chain. And that is where we find that, we cannot say the same for all OEMs. And what is required over here is that the principle 1, 3, and 5, which talks of governance of companies, which talks of taking care of employees, and the fifth one, human rights, which Viraf is talking about, is something which needs to go down the supply chain. SDGs, in fact, ILO in their recent technical meeting in February 2021 has identified auto sector as one of the drivers of to achieve the sustainable development goals. And one of the goals, that is SDG 8, though many companies have reported on SDG 8, one indicator is not finding place in the reporting, is the indicator 8.8. Now, this particular indicator actually talks about protecting labor rights and promoting safe and secure working environment for all workers. So our point over here is that indicator 8.8 should be made. I mean, you're asking how OEMs can do it. I think they should define indicator 8.8 and report on it. The other part is GRI reporting. When we see GRI reporting 403, yes, many OEMs have reported on 403. The workers, probably the definition of workers in GRI 403 is, it includes those workers in supply chain. So while in the annual reports, the OEMs are reporting on, the number of accidents, the number of man-hours lost, and, fatal injuries and non-fatal injuries, the report is there. But what we find missing is, the reporting on the supply chain. So these are some of the areas where, the OEMs, the auto brands can take a lead, and the boards can actually set the course for the implementation of international policy frameworks. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Chitra, for summarizing it very well. Now it seems that we have almost 10 minutes left for the session. So 2 minutes each, either I devote to panelists, or do we need to keep a question answer session for the audience as well, Sandeep, Meenakshi, or we can go ahead with our panel comments?
Sir, you can go ahead with the panels, because the questions coming up, the speakers are answering those things.
Okay, thank you very much. So Mr. Raju, as it is clearly evident that the larger share of responsibility, ultimately lies to have this top-down approach rather than the bottom-up. So what do you think as a way forward, which will be, replicated by other OEMs, notwithstanding which segment of vehicle they are manufacturing? So Mr. Raju, your final comment on this panel subject.
Yeah, we as the OEM and at the top of the chain, so we do realize that the responsibility on the OEM is much higher, and also efforts are on in the same direction. I would just like to point out one thing about, for example, this GRI, Global Responsibility standards adopted. They define the relationship between where there is a contractual relationship, they say that you should use your influence to also promote an improvement with the person whom you're contracting. So that's a very practical way of taking this forward. Certainly, we do believe that as a buyer, OEMs should use their whatever you call it, influence or whatever, to promote improvements at in the people with whom they are contracting. The question then comes, what about further down the line? Well, that also does get covered in a way, in the sense that when you are influencing the your tier one, amongst the other things you also check is what is he doing further down the line? What is he, does he devote enough resources to further improving down the line? I think, and does he, for example, follow all these steps with his down the line? So even if we are not directly in contact with tier two, because of this relationship, contractual relationship with the tier one, I think it affords us a responsible, the facility to see what is happening further down the line. But I also think an important aspect of this whole thing is the information flow. How do we monitor whether improvements are taking place? We have a responsibility. We have to question, to influence the tier one to carry out these improvements. Training, sensitization sessions, audits, reports from tier one, again, on the process. How many camps conducted, how many these things done, how many these things done, and also the result. Activity reporting, maybe it's better, but result reporting, there are limitations there. So this is also something which we have to look at. So one of the things which I had also suggested in my presentation is availability of actual data on injuries which are taking place, not through the players in the field, but independently from maybe the government or from government bodies or from NGOs. I'll just take a parallel example just for explaining the concept. We do carry out quality improvements, process improvements to improve the quality, again done by audits, by reports from suppliers on improvements in their process and so on. But we always have a way of checking whether each of these activities is actually taking place on the ground or not. And the way we can confirm that is if things are not okay, there is a quality problem and we come to know of it, either on our line or later on from the market in terms of warranty or later market problems. Now, so there is a check available there. And so that is one aspect I would like to also bring out, that while this is an enabler for really driving this activity forward, if we can have this kind of data, independent data.
Thank you for giving the OEM perspective. When it comes to tier one suppliers or suppliers at large, as they are handling multiple OEMs. So, Mr. Arora, I would like to come to you that preventive or predictive maintenance is one of the way where perhaps the differentiation can come on OHS results. So do you think there could be some commonization of expectations from each OEM when it comes to compliance requirement or bare minimum safety management in tier one versus how this preventive or predictive maintenance can improve the performance? So your take on the subject, and as a tier 1 supplier, you have committed that yes, they are responsible to convey down the line the overarching policies of OEMs. So how do you take it forward, and your views on this?
Mr. Banerjee, it's not just the Indian OEMs, but even the foreign OEMs who place a lot of importance on safety. And I can tell you of an example where in my brother-in-law's factory in Chennai, a stream of ants was discovered on one of the windowsills of the 10 or 20,000 square foot area in a shed, and that entire factory was sealed for 10 days by IKEA. So so those are the kind of things, and then I looked at IKEA as a supplier to become a supplier myself, and their audits are so stringent, and their requirements are so stringent, and I think probably that will happen in this country as well. But the tier ones in this country have nice big sheds and nice big areas and nice industrial estates where they work out of from. The main problem arises in the tier 2 and the tier 3, where they are working in areas which are congested, which are with potholes, which their workers navigate the potholes every day when they get to work. So the entire ecosystem there is an issue, and that needs to be corrected ASAP by the government. Because if that is not, we will, of course, we can drive the mentality business down, owner's attitude, but then there has to be reciprocating action from the government. The situation out there in the tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 industrial areas is pathetic in most cases. So that needs to be fixed as well. When Safe in India recommends this safety thing, this has to be taken up with the government about the industrial infrastructure in the smaller manufacturers. Now coming to the safety aspect, this ESG thing will have to be made mandatory. Sustainable manufacturing will have to be made mandatory for tier 1s, and then going down the line for tier 2s. That if you are not a green supplier in sustainable manufacturing, well, you are no longer our supplier. You're no longer a vendor to an OEM. And this is happening. This has happened already. If you are a vendor to Scania or Volvo or Mercedes, they want you to be a sustainable ESG compliant manufacturer, and safety is one of those features right down there. So it's not just about safety; it's about environment. It's about India is going to take over the chairmanship of the G20 next year, and this is going to come in a very major way with climate control and safety and all these things. So I think it is the entire ecosystem that needs to be relooked and needs to be overhauled, so that safety becomes a center stage in the minds of all the manufacturers.
Thank you. Dr. Ilangovan, I think there are many companies which are by mandate ISO 18000 compliant, and their policy state that they have to comply with OHS requirements. So, from your point of view as a inspector or regulator who is looking at compliance requirements, so in a new labor code, what do you think? How the inspection has changed? And what kind of additional state government or central government policies can help, improve performance and worker safety? So, Dr. Ilangovan, your final comment on the entire complex subject of achieving this target for social good.
So basically, there are two things. One is what is going on. The existing regulatory requirements are really elaborate, very generic, and more specific also. And it talks about the commitment of the employer, employee, manager, and rights and duties of work, and so on. The issue comes basically to the formal sector versus informal sector. The manufacturing process establishments which do not have 10 workers at any one day in the process will not be considered as a factory as under Section 2M of the factory. The first and foremost caution would be that these factories will not be covered under the Factories Act, and therefore safety and health provisions may not be made mandatory for these workplaces. However, in fact, we have discussed on many occasions on this aspect. There is a Section 85(1) of the Factories Act, which talks about workplaces to be a factory, to enable the safety and provisions to apply to those workplaces, irrespective of the number of workplaces. Of course, this is within the domain of the respective state government as per the law. Coming to DG FASLI, of course, we coordinate, and therefore we are, our activity, if you look, we are assisting the ministry in the policy framework on occupational safety and health. And we also do conduct studies, surveys, seminars, workshops. We are open to support the auto industry, the major, medium, smaller, whatever it is, to see that the safety and health culture is inculcated among our workforce. So our institutes located at Chennai, Kolkata, Kanpur, Faridabad, and presently we are, the construction is there, new RLA at Shriram. We are given jurisdiction, regional jurisdiction for these institutes. We can give extensive support to this sector, particularly on whatever matters connecting to occupational safety and health, apart from your advisory services, research, consultancy, kind of training, capacity building measures. In fact, even though we work on train the trainer concept, I'm also thinking to cover directly to go to the workers and tell them on safety things, publishing materials on safety, sector specific, process specific, machinery specific, situation specific, and so on. Coming to the code, as it has been already informed during the introduction, the government of India has formed committees, expert committees to frame standards on occupational safety and health pertaining to factories, docks, construction, and fire safety. And these committees will be framing standards as under Section 18(1) of the code. Basically, I would say the code brings in the uniform occupational safety and standards in the country, which will be uniform throughout the country, and which has also set a platform to relook the which are approximately 60, 70 years old, which need to be relooked, revalidated, and how these standards can be made up to date, reflecting the ground realities as on today. The expert committees are doing their job, and of course, that will really bring in a new system. After that, the second important point is this code has paved way for creation of the National Advisory Board on Occupational Safety and Health, the tripartite board, an apex body in the country on occupational safety and health. Apart from that, it also provides for third-party audit and certification, very important. So for fact, people always say we have done 18,000 audit, 45,000 audit, and so on. But third-party audit and certification and a scheme to be evolved, and this third-party audit will be under the code, and this will ensure managements to re-evaluate or evaluate their own compliance standards and get convinced on the level of compliance, and also identify the gray areas or areas to further improve upon. So this is another important issue. Apart from the uniform standards, of course, the inspection system can read to the code. It says that we've enabled a risk-based inspection system. So basically, the code will bring in uniform standards throughout the country. It will bring in various new features, including recognition of research institutions, and to talk about the update standards, bring in new risks that may happen in workplaces. All those things will be part of the code. And as far as the subject matter is concerned, We are open if the is very particular that if they have any requirement or if they feel that the FASLI has to do something in upgrading their knowledge, awareness, capacity building measures, or any type of inputs in terms of occupational safety, then we are open to it and our support will be there, because ultimately the objective of the organization is to ensure workplaces which are free from accidents, injuries, and illnesses. It's a kind of vision zero, and we work on inculcating safety culture at workplaces. And we'll be open if there are to be done on sector-specific requirements. Very important. You know, tires, tire industry, first tire, second tire, 3 tire, 4 tire. If there are some harsh concerns in respect of the particular tire, maybe if the associations come forward, we'll be in a position to definitely address it because it's within our mandate. Very important point is the generating awareness and knowledge among the workers. Which I mean very particularly regular employees, temporary employees, casual employees, part-time, piece rate, everyone. At least we need to look into framing, training, target-specific, audience-specific, subject-specific in language, mother tongue-oriented language, need-based training. All those things we should think about it, because training is the only one which can generate awareness, make them more knowledgeable. Their errors may be reduced, and therefore the accidents, risks, near misses in the workplaces can be brought down. I think we are open. I'm sure, and I'm really hopeful that whatever efforts which you want DigiFASLI to support in terms of occupational safety, health, and working environment in workplaces, we are giving complete support to all these initiatives. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Elangon. I think awareness creation training is the essence of this, challenge mitigation plan. And Mr. Mehta, in that case, do you think that worker assistance centers for skill development and recommending career pathways for these particularly small manufacturing enterprises, because OEMs and tier ones are more or less well protected and well sensitized? So as far as the small manufacturing enterprise goes, do you think that local regional worker assistance centers wherein they can be advised in the local language, as Dr. Elangon rightly mentioned, so is this the way forward you see, or something else you would like to recommend?
Thank you very much. Because I think once again, there's this notion sometimes that we've seen in certain industries where you can deny one right, let's say collective bargaining, freedom of association, and hope for improvements in others. And the fact is that they are interrelated, as we have seen in so many studies on labor situations in the last several months of the COVID pandemic, particularly, for example, with migrant workers going from host state to receiving state and the dual responsibilities of both, and finding that even, situations of human trafficking in this day and age, in pandemics, right from the rural areas and tribal areas, unsurprisingly, like Chhattisgarh and Jharkhand, these have been well studied. So I think that those sort of conglomerates, those sort of associations where workers receive the sort of input, preparing them even for migration, what to expect, is absolutely required, because you heard Sandeep in the beginning talking about migrant workers, and they are discriminated at yet another level of housing, access to medical services, discrimination based on language, and so forth. And these are the human rights associated with a being trying to make a living in sometimes a very dangerous job. I just wanted to, we have used abbreviations like OEMs and tier 1 and 2, and I think that's fine for technical use. But look ahead. The consumers of this world are buying a Maruti car, buying a Tata car, buying a Mahindra, buying a Ford, and they're not really going to be very receptive to a long, narrative of why safety remains an issue with the manufacture of that product. They want to be assured that children have not worked at any stage in its manufacture. They want assurance that people's lives have not been lost. And this requires transparency and disclosure from the OEMs in terms of what's happening in their value chain. I think in the world of outsourcing, the differential responsibilities and levels of human rights protection is a non-starter in the 21st and 22nd century. As car makers even evolve into mobility and transportation companies in that journey, human rights will be a constant. In Bangladesh, when that horrible fire took so many lives, Rana Plaza, what happened? Brands got together, competitors got together. Now, whether it's 1% of CSR that should be set aside for improvements in the supply chain, because what would we do if we find children disposing of car waste, if we find children deep in the supply chain? It's got to be identified and acted upon. So I think in these circumstances that there is a clear differentiation between allowable, I will do for my company and my brand what my culture and my policies dictate, but this will be overridden very quickly by an expectation of the entire sector. It's very difficult today to argue or to make the case that one mine amongst 50 mining iron or aluminum, the metals that car makers use, and the rubber are not going to be issues of the future. Where is the lithium source for, and so forth? So I think that the entire message to the auto sector in the corporate human rights benchmark and others is that we want to know the conditionalities of production of this thing that we are buying beyond its apparent and obvious cost and quality. And those companies that take the lead with these collectively and otherwise will succeed. And this is already happening. So my last comment or word would be having seen the business climate since I've been working in the mid-80s with the Tata Group in those days. I think we at some level, we have a gap of leadership, real corporate leadership, because I find it hard to identify as a consumer a name attached to a sustainable development goal, a CEO talking about women's rights and so forth. And we had it in this country with so many people. And I'm saddened that this is the case. These are leadership issues that will take our country forward in this century and the next, because the world is looking for socially and environmentally clean India. And I think we've got a big enough domestic market and a democracy to actually make this window happen for us today. And if we're talking about safety today, we have to talk about discrimination, we have to talk about harassment, we have to talk about safety of women in the same breath. It's part of the same culture. The issues may be different, but the root causes that lie in a human rights framework are unchanging and unlikely to go anywhere but on the ascendancy through investors, consumers, etc. So I think the brands have to take the lead, and they know how to do it. And some part of this will have to be through collective reporting, legislation, and so forth. And some, as usual, the leader takes risks and reaps benefits, as we see. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mehta. As we are already overshot the time, may I request the last word from Chitra? How do you think we can improve this particular menace which we are facing?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Banerjee. And I'll just wrap up quickly. There are a lot of things in our report which we can have discussion on, specifically the definition of what each of the standards and policies are looking for. Basically, to list out 2-3 things, which is, which we think is very simple. One is defining suppliers. I mean, you have code of conducts, you have supplier code of conducts, you have OSH policies. If OEMs can define suppliers, I think it will be brilliant, and we know what we are talking about. The second thing, what we are talking about is sectoral standards. Viraf says that, coming together. Yeah, I think SIAM, ACMA, the industry in all, can come out with sectoral standards, can come out with SOPs for both simple and complex processes. What the industry is, taking from the deeper supply chain, and give them the technical know-how to access and work in those in line of those standards and in line of those SOPs. I think this is the minimum what we can do. And with the closing statement, we would really like to see OSH in deeper supply chain of auto sector as an agenda of OEM board meetings. We really want boards to give a thought to it and take actions for it. Thank you.
Thank you, Chitra, for your comment. Before I hand over this panel discussion at the end to Mr. Sandeep, I would like to really summarize that from OEM side, from auto component perspective, from the government and regulators side, and of course the workers' human rights point of view, we have had a very nice discussion. And may I now request Sandeep to come and give his concluding remarks, summarizing what all we have achieved today. Over to you, Sandeep.
Thank you so much, Mr. Banerjee. This is excellent. And thank you so much for those incisive, insightful questions. We heard some very important things. I'll quickly summarize what various speakers have said today, which has been very, very positive, constructive, and helpful for us in our agenda. And after that, in the end, I'll request Mr. Raju, if you can play the video that you talked about at the very end, and people can see it if they're still there. It was great to see, I think at some point, almost 200 people attending this conference. So clearly there is interest, and I'm hoping that means action. We have a start here. This is a national issue. It's a long way to go. There is accountability and transparency and actions to work upon, and we will work on it together. And in that context, when we started the day, Rajesh Menon, DG SIAM, was very clear and very simple in his words and straightforward, acknowledging the problem and committing specific actions, which of course we will take forward with SIAM. So great start. Thank you for that. Winnie very passionately made the case for migrant workers for safety, also committed actions on behalf of ACMA, and asked OEMs to take greater leadership. And I think that's an important theme throughout, as we have been suggesting. Mr. Raju came in from Maruti, and once again, he was very clear. And I noted some of the key words amongst many. He said, raise the bar. But in my words, there is a need for tough love. We of course need to love our suppliers, but it needs to be tough. Increase the cost of accidents in the country. Probably that's what we need to do. And see both activities and results. And he asked the government and others to increase transparency and reporting around these accidents. We'll play our role, but I think Mr. Dr. Langovan, you have your role also over there. And Dr. Langovan talked very lucidly about the legal accountability of the occupier. And I think that's something in our country. Obviously, we are not as legalistic as UK or US or several other countries. And the cost of accident is very low. In the UK, for cut hands, you're talking crores of rupees equivalent, right? Whereas here people get away in thousands of rupees sometimes. That has to change and will change. He talked about training of workers, training of supervisors, and also implicitly training of owners, especially of smaller companies. And I think that's important, that the business case for safety, apart from technology, the technical aspects of safety, is well understood by the smaller suppliers. The larger suppliers, like Mr. Sunil Arora today, are very clear on it. He said, safety makes business sense, full stop. Otherwise, we will lose business. And he said the examples of losing business already. And when we were talking about this issue earlier with Mr. Arora, we discussed about how for the next generation of leadership coming, our children coming into this space, are they really going to come to a mom and pop corner cutting shop, or are they looking at their own parents to take leadership, to take it to the next steps, their own industry and the country? Or are we going to stay in that old mindset, which we talked about also? Viraf obviously very passionately talked about human rights. He talked about risk of not complying with human rights to the business, increasing that risk with time as things move on, and as ethical consumerism sets in, as consumers demand more of all of us. I know it's not as easy for customers to demand, a car made on safer workers, but it's only a matter of time. And the Rana Plaza example that he gave is absolutely the point. Bangladesh was given a burning platform on Rana Plaza. The result is that the garment industry there is more professional, is safer, and the fact is during COVID, Bangladesh went ahead further of India in garment industry because the industry was set up for all sorts of bad reasons as a result of Rana Plaza, we believe, right? So there is that call of leadership from the brand leaders and others to take us forward. Rishi Sharma earlier on talked about technology, how actually a good factory can be made safer and more productive. Mr. Banerjee kept it together and asked some very good questions. So really, I think as a summary, I have to thank my team. Chitra specifically has spent endless nights poring over hundreds of documents of tens of OEMs and figuring out what are the gaps, opportunities. We have that in our report, SafetyNiti. I would request everybody here and the OEMs and the suppliers to please read it. Give us feedback. If there is anything you want to add, we will add it. We'll amend it in the next edition of it. And I'll close it with a big thank you.